I should. um, right. I should probably introduce myself. Great. My name is Will Bryan. I'm an environmental historian here in Atlanta. My work covers the conservation movement in the South, the history of the conservation movement in the South, especially through the lens of its waterways. And so Proctor Creek, for that reason, is really interesting to me. So we're standing at the headwaters of Proctor Creek here in downtown Atlanta, right by the 5 Points MARTA station over here. Proctor Creek really starts under our feet, and that's important for a lot of reasons. One is that when you look around where I'm standing, all you see is concrete. You don't see any water. And so that means that anytime it rains here in what we call the Gulch in Atlanta, all of that water has to go somewhere, and it all goes into Proctor Creek. And as we're going to see, that has impacted the history of this watershed and the people who live there in really important ways for hundreds of years. The history of Atlanta is a little bit unique among major cities. It's one of the biggest cities that was founded with one of the smallest water sources nearby. Atlanta started as a railroad city. It was simply kind of a railroad junction that was put on the map, and eventually all of this that we're standing in grew up right at that railroad junction. But the result of that is that there's no major water source nearby. The Chattahoochee River is relatively small, as rivers go, at least compared to other cities that were founded about the same time. And so Atlanta, because of that, has always struggled to provide water to its citizens, to provide clean water to its citizens, to prevent flooding, to whisk away wastes that are created here in the city. And so really Atlanta has always had a water problem, simply because it didn't have a ready supply of water guaranteed early in its history. So the history of Atlanta really is a history of what elevation your neighborhood is at. Way back in Atlanta's early history, neighborhoods were segregated, but they were largely segregated on the basis of elevation, with white neighborhoods being at higher elevations and black neighborhoods being at lower elevations. And so the result of that is that water that was flowing away from downtown Atlanta and from higher parts of the city flowed through largely black neighborhoods. And when I say water, I mean not just water, I mean all of the stuff that the water brings with it. So pollutants, sewage, and many other toxic and dangerous wastes. And so segregation really in Atlanta was not just a story of race, which was the determining factor in where you live, but that played out on the basis of elevation. And the results of that were, do you live in a safe and secure area, or do you live in an area that was flood prone and potentially dangerous? So it may not seem like it, but this is a really great location to talk about environmental justice in America. Environmental justice is really simply based on the idea that communities of color face higher environmental risks from toxics, from pollution, from landfills and other sources than other communities. And that's largely based on race. Income is a determining factor, but race is really the key factor in environmental justice. And this part of Atlanta is a great place to begin to have conversations about what environmental justice means, where that idea came from, and how long it's been with us. Because I think looking at environmental justice through Proctor Creek and through the history of this really unique watershed shows us that environmental justice really is not a recent phenomenon. Scholars often think of the origins of the environmental justice movement as a 1982 protest in Warren County, North Carolina, over the siting of a toxic waste landfill in a predominantly African American community. But the reality is that communities of color have recognized that there are environmental threats that are both threats to the environment, but also threats to human health and threats to civil rights, and have actively sought to combat those threats for much longer than simply the decades since 1980s. And Atlanta, I think, is a really good example of this. And Proctor Creek especially, I think, shows this very clearly. Because about more than a century ago, in the early 20th century, it began in Vine City, just west of where we're standing right now, when residents there realized that this company that had been hired to burn Atlanta's garbage was actually dumping it into Proctor Creek and were causing health problems for people living in the neighborhood. And so residents organized through Temple Baptist Church, which was in the community of Vine City, and the pastor of that church actually led the fight against pollution of Proctor Creek by this garbage company. That action ultimately culminated in legal action against the city. They did not win that battle in the short term, but in the long term, their action really did play a key role in forcing the city of Atlanta to build the first sewage treatment plants to filter things that were actually being put into the water in Proctor Creek. That would lead to another 100 years of action to continue to clean up Proctor Creek, but that was a major victory in this effort. The history of Proctor Creek is very much bound up, I think, with the history of Atlanta's struggle to build adequate sewage infrastructure so that people were, not exposed to potentially harmful pollutants entering Atlanta's waterway. Going back to Atlanta's founding, there was no sewage infrastructure. It was simply waterways that people would dump waste into and, hope to never see those wastes again as they were whisked downstream. That includes Proctor Creek, that includes Peachtree Creek, that includes all of the other watersheds in Atlanta. However, over time, these kind of informal channels that were built to whisk wastes from, downtown Atlanta, from homes, from businesses, they were eventually converted into kind of the more formal sewers that we have today. And so the, kind of early patterns where these wastes flowed through largely black neighborhoods because white city leaders deemed it acceptable for those neighborhoods to be exposed to these wastes, whereas, they did not believe that it would be acceptable for white neighborhoods to be exposed to these wastes. Those patterns were largely codified when the city's initial sewage infrastructure followed that same kind of pattern. And the result is we have this kind of system of combined sewers in Atlanta where sewage and floodwater essentially go through the same pipes. And so the result of that, fast forwarding about 100 years, is that, when it rains a lot, sewage gets into the water, and that sewage is going to affect the communities who really can least afford it. And those are largely black neighborhoods that are kind of downstream and have been downstream for about 100 years of these problems. So in the years after the lawsuit that was brought by residents of Vine City against pollution of the creek, these problems, despite the construction of new sewage infrastructure in Proctor Creek, really only became worse. And that's primarily because, this was really a boom time for the city of Atlanta. This is when we began to kind of shift from older types of transportation infrastructure to more modern types of transportation infrastructure through cars. This is when we began to have the origins of a building boom in downtown Atlanta, the construction of parking lots and, impervious surface, combined with the construction of new and bigger buildings. And the result of all of this construction in the city and the growth in population really up to the mid to late 20th century was that the water problems that really had existed from the city's inception only became magnified. And the problems of runoff from downtown especially were magnified as even a small rain would send millions of gallons of water flowing, into nearby waterways, in particular in downtown into Proctor Creek. These problems, I think, are magnified even more by the fact that Proctor Creek is a pretty small watershed and, really didn't have the capacity to handle all of the waste that were flowing into it from the city of Atlanta. We're standing here at the north end of the Proctor Creek Greenway, which runs just to my right. Behind me, you can see Proctor Creek itself, shortly before it empties into the Chattahoochee. So you can see, Proctor Creek headed towards its outlet at the Chattahoochee here. The pollutants coming from downtown Atlanta were not the only thing that was threatening Proctor Creek, the wildlife in it, and residents who lived around it. There was also industrial pollution from nearby manufactories and also the Inman Rail Yard, which is just about a half a mile from where we stand right now. This is one of the largest railroad yards in the country, and it was really expanded in the late 1950s by the Southern Railway to serve as kind of a transshipment point for a lot of Southern Railway cargo. And so, just about a half a mile from where I'm standing right now is one of the densest concentrations of rail infrastructure, certainly anywhere in Atlanta and Georgia, and probably anywhere in the southeast as well. And the result is, that it's had a pretty real impact on Proctor Creek at various points in the creek's history. For instance, in 1970, one of the biggest oil spills really in the Chattahoochee's history and Proctor Creek's history began at Inman Rail Yard, a few hundred yards from where we're standing. A pipe that was carrying diesel fuel burst, and unfortunately it was not discovered until 5 days later that it had been leaking into Proctor Creek. And so by the time that it was discovered and patched, there was an oil slick that covered Proctor Creek, really from here to its outlet at the Chattahoochee, and then all the way down the Chattahoochee about 100 miles to West Point, Georgia. The city of West Point and LaGrange actually had to alter how they were getting water for drinking for residents of the cities because the oil slick was so significant. And it took a long time to break up, and eventually the Southern Railway was fined a few $1,000s for this. And it was sort of unprecedented at the time that the company would even actually be fined. Problems continued to come from Inman Rail Yard into Proctor Creek, and even downstream, from the Chattahoochee, from where we are. Unfortunately, the problems in the creek didn't stay in the creek. They affected people who lived, on the boundaries of the creek. They flowed out of the creek's boundaries when, it rained or when the water was running high. And they affected people's homes. They affected people's, walking in the streets. They affected people going about their daily business. By putting them in contact with, floodwaters, with all of the kind of toxic and otherwise dangerous wastes that were caught up in those floodwaters from downtown Atlanta all the way to where we are. And these problems of flooding really were not solved even by the 70s, even by the 80s. There were periodic attempts to, fix infrastructure that, potentially could make these problems better. In the 70s, for instance, there was a failed bond referendum that would have spent $10 million trying to fix a lot of the infrastructure that kind of dumps into Proctor Creek. It failed, and so that money was not spent on Proctor Creek. And so these problems continued, really into the 1990s, when in fact the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper brought a lawsuit that resulted in a consent order that, really began to, force some sort of effort to kind of grapple with these problems and begin to fix the infrastructural issues that were, kind of really deep-seated and, more than a century old that led to them. So the site we're standing on right now is the site of the former Perry Homes, which is one of the largest public housing complexes in the city of Atlanta. And it had about 1,100 housing units. So it's a really densely packed area. Really, its heyday was the 1960s and 1970s. And it backs up right to Proctor Creek. And so, the result of that is that the residents of Perry Homes were disproportionately, really faced with the hazards that the creek, kind of brought to their front door, really from downtown Atlanta. So floodwaters running down, really from the heart of downtown would make their way here to where we're standing. And with those floodwaters came a host of other issues, whether that's, toxics or other harmful pollutants. And the result is that the people who lived there were, at a high risk for the health problems that were caused by pollution of the creek that really flowed into their backyard and into their, their living spaces. So the residents of Perry Homes, in many cases, fought back and sought to actually, get funding allocated that could, ameliorate some of these problems and especially for people in Perry Homes and others who lived, in such close proximity to the creek. The Perry Homes Tenants Union actually succeeded in getting the federal government to expend some money in Proctor Creek as a result of, their efforts to crack down on some of the pollutants flowing through the creek. This goes all the way back to the early 20th century when residents of Vine City were fighting against, the garbage company that was dumping pollutants into Proctor Creek because they claimed that it was hurting the health of people living in Vine City. And those health consequences continue, in some ways up to the present, but certainly you see them magnified as settlement around Proctor Creek grows more dense. For instance, in 1970, Emory University Legal Services filed a lawsuit against the city because 2 children living here contracted typhoid from the water of Proctor Creek. That's a single incident, but the health risks like that were not uncommon for people living in the areas surrounding Proctor Creek. So we started at the Gulch, at the headwaters of Proctor Creek, which is about 5 miles this way. And at the other end of Proctor Creek is another kind of historic site, the site of the former Chattahoochee Brick Company. And this was a brick manufacturing company that operated in the late 19th century, and that really only survived by exploiting convict labor to make the bricks in the factory. These were largely black convicts who were leased by the state to the company. Many died while working at the brick company, and it was a hugely exploitative endeavor. The site of the Chattahoochee Brick Company was recently purchased and has been the subject of a vigorous debate in the past few years about how to properly memorialize the lives of the people who were employed there. So more recently, Proctor Creek has kind of shifted away from being something that's just been buried in Atlanta's historical record to something that's kind of been unearthed and turned into a natural amenity for residents living in this area. There's been a lot of construction of residential housing in this area. The path is running right by me here and has created a several mile stretch of Proctor Creek Greenway for recreation purposes. And all of this is kind of redefining what it means to live near Proctor Creek, positively contributing to solving many of the problems that have plagued Proctor Creek throughout its history. It does raise other questions, and I think these are questions that Atlanta is going to have to confront in coming generations. How do we ensure that these amenities don't just go to the wealthy? And how do we ensure that they go to longtime residents of these neighborhoods rather than displacing those residents? That's going to be, I think, the central dilemma that this sort of re-envisioning of Proctor Creek brings to the city of Atlanta and to the communities that live in the areas surrounding Proctor Creek.